So for this module, we're going to focus on migration. We're going to focus on the notion of migration in general, to start with. We'll go to a couple of case studies or a couple of specific examples out of the US. And I'll also share some thoughts out of a paper that's focused on sociological understandings of migration and the rise of Trump as obviously a fairly recent phenomenon for us. Of great proportions and of great significance. I won't be focusing so much though on that particular politics, but more on the larger processes of the human experiences within the realm of nation states and all the politics, of course, that arises out of that. So it's about bigger processes, longer processes, not as ephemeral as presidencies or non-presidencies or whatever. So thinking about the structural and cultural controls that are encountered through movement into nation states. We will shift focus to Australia as the main case study for this. And in doing so, I'm going to take the lens out wider again to be thinking about the nation state and particular sets of ideas and values that are apparent and practices that are apparent in the Australian scene that are different to other places, which of course is fully in accordance with imaginaries, because in the migration world and the policy scape, there is an awful lot of policy borrowing, ideas that are borrowed and spread across. But as imaginaries says, these ideas still have to embed into the realities of a local, national, socio-historical realities, political realities, with how those places have evolved different to other places and how they adapt the ideas is going to have its own particular inflection in amongst the general trends that are also apparent. What we're going to be going to do in this module is invite you to gauge something of the ideas and opinions of some of the people around you, just a very, very small scale interview study that we'll ask you to do. And just to get some sense of views and to be thinking about how we analyze that, how we work with that kind of raw data, if you like. And I think that part of what we're trying to capture here is how people imagine the nation. And there will be some reference to Benedict Anderson's notion of the nation as an imagined community. I'm not going to go into the details of that here. But what this then takes us to is what we're trying to interrogate is how people imagine Australia, Australian culture, and to investigate the whys of this and to speculate on that. So what I want to do right now is just share a couple of quick thoughts about migration in general. And from there, just introduce a couple of other notions that may help us orient conceptually, theoretically, into what we're doing. So if you think about migration, it has, it's about population redistribution in geographical space. We're talking here about a change of residence that is intended to be long-term or permanent. And of course, when we see it like this, I hope you realize that we're not necessarily talking about international migration, that intranational migration is also significant and can be considered, is actually obviously deeply significant in people's lives. It doesn't have the same implications of international travel, of course, although in the time of Corona, we became much more aware, we have become much more aware of how national borders or how significant they can be in particular times of crisis. If we start to think about the reasons for migrate, well, opportunity is usually primary here, in that sense of people are searching for a better life or a better existence. Of course, many are moving because of an existential threat to themselves or to their emotional well-being. There's that sense of danger there, so the physical, emotional threats. But there's also the threat of environmental change that we're becoming increasingly aware of, and which we will ignore at our peril. But the chances are, in your time, you will be dealing with some of these issues and some of the decisions that have to be made about people seeking refuge in places of higher ground, literally. But I think sometimes that what gets ignored in the literature are not just these functional reasons, these instrumental reasons for change or for shifting place of residence, but it's also about people seeking some excitement in their lives, some difference, something different, a change, a challenge. It's quite complicated. So these are the usual push-pull factors that are talked about. You know, the sending countries, stagnant economies, high unemployment, foreign exchange from workers' remittances is deeply significant. We'll certainly be contemplating some of that. The receiving countries, strong economy, ample employment, particularly a need for low-skilled manufacturing sector. This is more the post-war realities. These days, of course, we're talking also about skilled migration being significant. Businesses are looking for both, let's not call it the ends of the spectrum, but both of those criteria in different ways, different forms, depending, of course, on the business. But I hope you can recognize here a sense of homo economicus. This is this sense of human beings are driven by material need, which then brings in its own forms of economic determinism, structural determinism being also part and parcel of that. And we can sometimes miss a focus on the agency of the migrant. And in a fairly recent account of migration and the reasons for migration, exploring some of this by three geographers, they make the point, and even if the move is motivated primarily by one overriding issue, migration is firmly embedded within the complexity of people's everyday lives and experiences. Migration decisions are often influenced by factors that are much less obvious than they might appear at first sight. So it's not just simple one singular things. It's a multivariate thing that are affecting the kinds of decisions that people are making. And this sometimes can be ignored, particularly when one is looking at the quantitative data around this. Forms of migration also important to consider. So we've already really covered much of this. The refugees, the asylum seekers exposed to some direct threat of persecution or death, often fleeing armed conflict, and returning home for them, although many wish for that, desire that, is too dangerous over the short to medium term, and they need sanctuary. And of course, as we know, people have a right to seek that sanctuary. Economic migrants, they move mainly to improve their lives by finding work, education. Education, of course, is very significant in this movement, and it's as Australia is very well aware of, and became even probably more aware of in the times of COVID. This can also include family reunion in this particular strategy. And associated with this, a kind of subset of this are the irregular migrants, sometimes referred to as illegal. Undocumented migrants is a common phrase in the US, as you're about to hear about. People who unlawfully reside in or on national territory, though unauthorized entry or overstaying, through unauthorized entry or overstaying a visa. And they may well be in unauthorized employment. In fact, it may be that unauthorized employment that brought them there in the first place. So just to give you some sense of the figures there, in June 2017, in Australia, the official figures are 62,900 people in that category of irregular migrant, illegal stayer. So unlawful non-citizens residing in Australia, as the official language goes. Now, this has been a fairly consistent figure over recent years. And something else that's worth noting is that nearly half of that figure, 62,900, have been in Australia for 5 years or more, and 18% have been in Australia for more than 20 years. So that's they're pretty significant figures and a significant amount of time to be in the place. It does look like these people might be just trying to stay. Okay, so if we just move along a wee bit more. Part of what we're doing here in thinking about migration and then moving us along then to think about the Australian nation state and some of the mythologies, some of the beliefs and values that we're inviting you to think about the ways in which Australia gets imagined as gets imagined and is in the public imaginary. And we're inviting you to interrogate some of those things. And of course, Australia being a settler nation, invader nation, they have particular kinds of, we have a particular history of migration, and migration surely is part of the imaginary and part of the ways in which policy, significant policy, has been shaped in this nation. Again, we'll talk further about this as we move along. But something that what we're also trying to get you to do is not just gather some data, a very small amount of it, but also to invite you to think about where these ideas come from. And I'm very attracted to and very influenced by the notion of common sense. Now, sociology is one of the things that sociology and anthropology, to a lesser degree, claims that it is seeking to do, is for people to challenge common sense, to challenge the beliefs and values that we've grown up with, to test them out, of course, to subject them to empirical investigation. And Gramsci, the Italian Marxist scholar, has developed some really interesting ideas about this in his time in prison, a very long period that he spent as an enemy of the state. He talks about common sense as being the sedimentary remains of scientific thought. Sedimentary remains of scientific thought. So they embed themselves into the belief systems of society. And I really was struck when I was reading Peter C.'s article about his insight that he shares about how racial purity became a part of the British colonial mindset in the late 19th century. So this sense of develop, the color bar developing out of that, we must not intermix, we must keep other races pure, otherwise there's a sense of pollution, a sense of loss of status, a loss of value. It devalues the white person, and of course there's a lot of devaluing of the person of color that goes into that. And Australian history is really curious from that point of view as well, because of the ways in which Australia shaped migration policy to match those kind of beliefs about purity. And again, we'll talk more about that, but it is worth remembering that in late 19th century Australia, not all that long ago, a lot of people held the belief that in Australia we were building a superior race of white people in this land. It was not an uncommon belief. And that could still be part of the kind of common sense that's there, as well as the ways in which this idea of purity has kind of embedded itself into our beliefs and values, into our belief systems. So to what extent do these kinds of beliefs, and there'll be quite a few others that may come up for you, still hold? And to what extent do they continue to spill over into our thinking about cultures, particularly maybe in some older people in this regard, but about cultures as pure or once pure, ignoring the historical realities of constant change. But yes, of course, constant change, but probably not on a scale such as we're seeing now. So all of this is by way of saying that you'll be interrogating beliefs and values, ideas about Australia and Australianness, Australian culture, and invited to think about where they come from, their cultural archaeology, if you like. We'll stay focused there for this week. And next week, we will deepen our understandings of migration patterns, the history of migration, of its control through a case study of Chinese migrants in Australia. Just to remind you, where we're going to go to next is to consider migration, well, not so much more generally, but through the lens of go into North America, as well as Mexico and Ecuador, so as people from those particular places reflect on their experiences through firstly a documentary film, and then through, well, perhaps it'll be a challenging podcast from the daughter of migrants, who of course becomes a migrant herself as a consequence of it. Um, let's go to that now, and I'll talk to you a little bit later, just sharing some further thoughts about it.